welcome to this webinar between peace and conflict, Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia. Today we'll be discussing our co-authored policy brief on how Eritrean refugees struggle after the 2018 peace deal between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And if you're interested in reading it, you can find it on the DIIS website. The report was written before the outbreak of the current conflict. So many things have obviously changed in the meantime, and we'll try to address that as we go along, even if there's right now limited knowledge of the situation on the ground, especially in the Tigray region. But it should be mentioned that only a few days ago, the UNHCR expressed grave concern for the Eritrean refugees caught in the crossfire in the refugee camps in the Tigray region, those camps also being cut off from the rest of the world. But the agenda today is that after my brief introduction, Dr. Tekalign Mengiste, an expert on Eritrean migration and assistant professor in social anthropology at the Addis Ababa University, will present the main findings of the report. Then Dr. Fekadu Tufa, associate professor, also from the Addis Ababa University, will discuss the findings. Dr. Fekadu is an expert on migration and borderland studies and the author of many peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Then finally, Hans Storgaard, Programme Delegate with the Danish Red Cross in Addis, will discuss the report and say a few words about the situation on the ground and what kind of humanitarian challenges the DRC is facing right now. Then we have a Q&A session where it's possible for the audience to pose questions using the Q&A function. But first, a few words on my own work and insight into Eritrean refugees. I mainly work with West African migrants, labor migrants going to Libya. But I had the opportunity to observe the situation of Eritreans in Tripoli during fieldwork in 2014. And it was interesting to see and concerning to see how the situation is more vulnerable in many ways. One thing that's striking about their journeys, of course, is that half of those journeys do not start in Eritrea, but start in other places, as discussed in the recent report by the Mixed Migration Center. They start from Ethiopia, or they start from the Sudan, which of course makes the situation in the camps an even more important issue. Also, the profile of the Eritrean refugees is a bit different from the ones from the West African migrants. Most are students. More than half of them have secondary school education, which is not so common among, for instance, Ghanaian unskilled labor force. Women constitute a much bigger part of the group, making them obviously more vulnerable to sexual exploitation and violence, whereas migrants in Libya in general are male, about 87% are male. And of course, the Eritrean refugees are different also in a Libyan context because they're all looking to go to Europe, whereas the West African migrants constitute a circular labor migration group, which also means that they have a better structure and protection around their stay in Libya, whereas Eritreans typically are much more dependent on smugglers and smuggling infrastructure. For instance, in places like Abu Salim in Tripoli, where I had the chance to visit one of the halfway houses where Eritrean refugees live. Also, Eritreans and East Africans in general are much more likely to be detained in Libya. Up to 4 times as many East Africans are detained in Libya than West African migrants, probably because they are looking to go to Europe and therefore held back or even sent back by the Libyan Navy. This means that a large proportion of those in the detention centers in Libya are East Africans and Eritreans stuck in this terrible situation. And for years, Eritreans were the main group going to Libya or going to Europe across the Mediterranean. That has changed significantly in recent years. But one worry is that many are actually stuck in Libya in the detention centers. We don't know how the current conflict and what's going on in Ethiopia right now in the camps will form or inform new migration movements. But it is of course likely that we will see more people going to Libya because of the current events. But with those few remarks, I will give the word to Dr. Tekalign Mengiste for him to present the key findings of our policy brief.
Thank you. Thank you, Hans. I will first share the contents of my presentation from our study findings. First, I will share the context and the peace deal generally, and then I will talk about challenges of Eritrean refugees facing in camps and out of camps. Then I will talk about the impact of COVID-19 and the current conflict in Tigray, briefly, of course, and then onward mobility of Eritrean refugees from Ethiopia. And finally, I will share you the recommendations we had from our study. To start with background of our study. The study was conducted before the current conflict happened in Tigray region. So we can only talk briefly about the current conflict and its impacts later in my presentation. So since we have conducted this study, many things changed, and things generally change fast in the region, as you all know. We can try to connect the previous experiences and challenges of Eritrean refugees and current conditions, of course. So to start with, to give you briefly the background of Eritrean refugee migration generally, as you know, Eritrea is still continuing to be one of the largest refugee-producing countries in Africa. Currently, Ethiopia is hosting more than 100,000 registered Eritrean refugees. The country is still also hosting equal or even more unregistered Eritrean refugees who live in towns and cities throughout the country. Many Eritrean refugees live, of course, in overcrowded campuses in Tigray region and also in Afar region. There are 6 campuses in Tigray and 4 campuses, I think 2 campuses in Afar region generally for Eritrean refugees. When we see the peace agreement and the current flights of Eritrean refugees or following the peace agreement, as we all remember, the peace agreement brought huge optimism and hope for Eritreans and Ethiopians in general, and also many concerned communities in the border areas. Of course, at the beginning, it also ended hostilities, long years of hostilities between the 2 countries, flights, and also phone lines opened. This even increased the optimism. Later, of course, it never went as expected from both sides, the peace deal, the fruits of peace deal, as people expect never reached to community, particularly to the communities of border areas. Because the first challenge was there was internal problems, political, economic problems continued in both countries, in Ethiopia and Eritrea as well. More importantly, the Tigray region, the regional government in Tigray, also was not actively engaged in the peace deal, and it has uneasy relations with Ethiopian regime, the federal government in Addis Ababa, and the Eritrean regime in Asmara. So it has been an obstacle for the peace deal to progress well. Meanwhile, refugee generating conditions in Eritrea never changed, even though the two countries concluded peace deal, made agreement to conclude a peace agreement, because the political challenges, economic problems, open military service, all the challenges that has been producing refugee migration in Eritrea continued. And then after the peace agreement, refugees arrival is even increased in Ethiopia. So you can see the statistics, of course, UNHCR reports and also our reports. It's accessible online, open access from this website. This means, generally already before the conflict, before the COVID-19 pandemic, Eritrean refugees already have been facing big challenges in the campus, even out of campus as well. So to give you the basic information, generally there was shortage of basic services, be it health and sanitation, food, nutrition, child protection, shelter, education, all this, there's dire shortage. It's below minimum standard according to various reports, and also UNHCR have been reporting. Also, refugees have been citing this, and we also observed this in different occasions. So it was very, very dire condition. And there was also this, many of refugees also moved to towns nearby campus, and also in Tigray region in general, has this created, host-refugee tensions. There was competition over resources between refugees and host communities. Rents, housing rents, increased in towns. So previously there was a tradition that Eritrean community, Tigray community generally welcomes the Eritrean refugees. That integration was fast. These two people share culture, kinship, and there was huge, interaction, and there was welcoming, and integration was very fast. But later on, because of many other problems, the relation became uneasy between host communities and refugees in camp areas. This has created mutual suspicion and blaming all the problems, many problems to refugees. Now what I'm talking is before the conflict. Now a different scenario, by the way. So, and also Eritrean refugees face challenges in urban areas as well, because Ethiopia has introduced a new refugee law, which is 1110/2019. The law brought a lot of provisions for durable solutions for Eritrean refugees to integrate fast in the country, but for many reasons this never translated into fully translated into or implemented at the ground. So even in urban areas, many refugees, Eritrean refugees, informally, get jobs in various sectors. These jobs are precarious and also unstable. There was many problems they are facing in big towns such as Mekelle and Addis Ababa. So the situation was very challenging, and over this COVID-19 pandemic brought additional challenge. This brought the challenge of COVID-19 was first mobility restrictions, bringing humanitarian services very difficult as a beginning, and also limited durable solutions because many focused on the health emergency responses, while refugee flow continued. So, and also there are changes from the Ethiopian side after the peace agreement. Previously, Eritrean refugees are given, directly refugee status, but later on there's a change in the law from previous determination of giving a refugee status for all groups now to individual case determination. So these are also created, big problem for Eritrean refugees according to their views, actually. Also, some refugees concerned that campus would be closed down. This was also concerned from the refugee side. So only during the COVID-19, big shortage of budget actually, because ARA officials and also all concerned authorities, explain that about 70–80% budget, reduced from international donors after the COVID-19 pandemic. This has created huge problem to provide services to the refugees by ARA, or Ethiopian Refugee and Returning Authorities Agency, and also it was big problem. So this is a layer of problems that came one after another over the Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia, while the refugee flow continued and even increased. So and then, of course, recently, as you know, conflict happened in Tigray region. We have very limited information about the conflict in Tigray region. From our research and experience, as you can understand what I'm presenting, already the refugees are in dire situation. Anyone can easily imagine when there is conflict, when mobility is restricted, refugees would be more precarious in their lives, because basic services, provisions of humanitarian services have been very difficult. And also mobility restrictions. UNHCR have been reporting challenges it has faced in delivering various services to refugees. We also, concerned about different actors may take advantage of refugees. The refugees are in a very difficult condition as the conflict is ongoing. There was different interests we may imagine. Maybe refugees are also more moving without authorization by the state. Thus, mobility also would create another problem. So generally, my understanding is we hope now, like phone lines are reopened, aids are now reached Mekelle, and there's hope and optimism from Ethiopian government side. They promise they would manage all the problems happening in Tigray region. For us as a researcher, our expectation, my expectation is it will depend on post-conflict transformations in Tigray region. Be it is reconciliation, be it also rebuilding infrastructure and opening all basic services will depend on how the Ethiopian government manage and fast end the conflict in the region. This would bring hope, and otherwise, obviously, it would be very challenging. But for the moment, we don't have primary information. What is going on? Very limited information is coming out. Of course, media has been reporting from different angles. We also concerned media is also exaggerating the situation and adding the fuel to the problem in the region. So there is different interest groups and there are different biased informations are also coming out from media. So this is also a big problem. But the hope is that the government would hopefully manage the conflict in the region and maintain the peace. Then it would change the situation. And of course, humanitarian organizations and international agencies, if they manage to reach the region and provide the service to refugees, that would be better, or we hope that would happen. So as you know, already because of these all problems, the response from refugees is usually it has been onward migration or transiting through Ethiopia. This has been a tradition among the Eritrean refugees. They have been moving towards Europe, to the Middle East and South America. UNHCR estimates that about 70–80% of refugees, Eritrean refugees, actually make onward mobility from camps. This is because many Eritrean refugees are young men and women, unaccompanied children. Some even avoid registering in camps because they are very aware the provisions and the services are very limited in camps, and so many using informal channels in the networks, move directly to come to towns and cities. So it has been long tradition refugees transit through Ethiopia. Often it was to Europe, but now this is changing. Traditionally, the migration destination of Eritreans was Europe. The usually expectation from European side is they all move to Europe through Sudan, Libya, but this is not the case now. It has been a long time. There's less to Europe due to border externalization of EU and the crisis in Libya. So many Eritrean refugees redirected their migration to Middle East, South Africa, and Latin America, and then to US. So there is emerging evidence for this. We don't have exact statistics, but from our studies in border areas, there are a lot of Eritreans also crossing to Djibouti, towards the Middle East, crossing to Ethiopia border Moyale to move to South Africa. So there's increasing evidence that they are more and more redirected their migration to other destinations in Gulf states, in South Africa, and in Latin America, and in the US. So it becomes more longer, as you can imagine, for refugees, more dangerous, more costly, and it's more increased their vulnerabilities. When the Libya route is more closed, migration never stopped. Eritrean refugees are arriving, and they are transiting, and they are also still migrating to other countries. We have some recommendations from our study. The first is, vulnerable Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia, particularly women, elderly, disabled, and the children, of course, need urgent humanitarian assistance, including shelters, food, water, sanitation, energy, and health care. So as I mentioned, there are different layers of challenges they are facing. So immediate humanitarian response should be increased, and this is very, very urgent. Another thing should be done is, of course, funds are needed for UNHCR, partner organizations, and administration for returnees and the refugee authorities, or ARA in Ethiopia, which is responsible for refugee governance in Ethiopia, to address continuous refugee arrivals in Ethiopia and the challenges posed by COVID-19, and also transform current conflict to peace in the Tigray region is also very, very important. And of course, donor countries should also communicate with Ethiopian government. Maybe still, since the problem in Eritrea still continued, we have to reintroduce, this prima facie recognition and allow access to protection of all Eritrean refugees. And of course, resettlement quotas to abroad should be increased. This is very, very small. And finally, we also recommended humanitarian support and emergency shelters should be provided in transit locations for smuggled and trafficked Eritreans need of urgent protection. They cross to Matamma, they cross to Moyale, they cross to Ethiopian migrants to Djibouti. So maybe Hans from ICRC can add more about this. So this is what I have. I stop here. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Tekalign, for that presentation. And now we have Dr. Fekadu Tufa to say, come with a few comments on the policy brief. And also please try to limit your intervention to about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. And congratulations, Tekalign and Hans, for this quite timely and interesting policy brief. I will be commenting selectively on three areas. The first one on the peace deal and the influx of Eritrean refugees. Second, on tensions between refugees and the host communities. And the third on moving onward and the call for intervention. The first one, I mean, just to start with one account, which I myself observed. In 2018, like a month after the peace deal was signed, I was doing field work around Ethiopia-Kenya border, which is the opposite border to Eritrea-Ethiopian border. Then, I mean, I've been doing research in that part for like the last 1 decade or more. And on our arrival, all accommodations in Moyale were booked. We couldn't find accommodations, and we were surprised, which was the first time in my history in that area. Then we asked what happened, and the people told us that it's all occupied by Eritreans. Quite strange. And then my research team was quite related. It was on migration facilitation, and I had some contacts with brokers, smugglers, and I asked it, what happened? Then they said two factors. One, that was after the peace deal, the border was opened. Then they said with the border opening, many people are leaving Eritrea in fear of the fact that the border might be reclosed. Then, interestingly, that happened in some 3 months' time. The border was reclosed. Second factor, they said with the peace deal, some of them are afraid of what will happen to them because of the good relationship between expected good relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea. So they are probably running away. Third, as Tekalign was presenting, there was a kind of change in the route of migration that due to the conflict in Libya, the problem in Sudan came later on. So many people are redirecting towards the south, some of them to Uganda, others to Kenya and South Africa. Then with that, I talk about the influx. As Tekalign was presenting, forced displacement and the migration have been embedded in Eritrean history. Though the major influx, the turning point for the last 2 decades, refugee influx was related to the Ethiopia-Eritrean border war of 1998 to 2000. Then, as you know, the border has been closed for around 20 years until it was militarized. But now, with the peace deal, many things have changed. Then the peace deal resulted in brief border opening, with a number of effects, as the report clearly mentioned. One significant effect, as the report also clearly mentions, is the influx has increased significantly. I was in northern Ethiopia. I visited the 4 refugee camps in November 2019, just a year ago. I did field work in November 2019. By then, officially, the ARA official told us that with the opening of the border, the number increased, the average daily arrival increased from 50 per day before the border opening to up to 1,500 as the report mentions a day. So it was significant and sudden increase. That sudden increase made refugee governance, especially camp governance, extremely difficult. Just for instance, shelter, as you mentioned. Officials were forced to put up to 15 individuals in a single shelter, while the standard is 5. So it was quite tough for them. As a result, officially, some 1,600 people were allowed to rent houses outside in the nearby towns. Those of them who afford to rent house were allowed to rent house outside the camp, but come back every month for ration. Then the other is also the border opening changes the demography of the refugees, especially in 3 campuses. These campuses are the campuses resided by the Tigrinya, the Highland Eritreans, resided in 3 campuses in Adarush, Maiaini, and Hisas. In those campuses, before the border opening, due to the militarization of the border, 73% of the refugees were male, single, and young. Now, with the border opening, that demography was changing. 91% of the new arrivals, 91.6% of the new arrivals were children, older people, sick people. So that changes the demography of Eritrean refugees, which Hans was talking, the Kali was talking. Now they are no more as young as we knew before 3 years. Then, but even after the border was closed, the border control remained a little bit loose. Thus, it's not as as before and as during the opening, but still, while I was there, like until the beginning of this conflict, most likely between 200 and 300 people are arriving every day still. So then the campus were quite dynamic. The number of arriving, the number of those leaving the camp were almost balanced before the border opening and before other factors in Libya, in Sudan, and so on happened. Now, with the demographic change, the mobility has reduced because it's not easy for family, for older people, for sick people, like the young, single, and the men would do. Thus, now with the conflict in Libya, the economic difficulty in Sudan, and the demographic change, now many people start to stay in the camp or broadly in Ethiopia. The mobility has reduced. Then on top of that, now COVID has come as a factor. Then the report also discussed the peace deal came with kind of double sword for the refugees. On the one hand, a number of positive developments came with the peace deal. Border control was loosened. Restriction on mobility has been eased. Communication resumed, especially compounded with the revised Ethiopian Refugee Proclamation. A number of positive developments have happened. On the other hand, as Tekalign was saying, the refugee admission, which was prima facie that every applying Eritrean asylum seeker were accepted, has now changed into case by case. Probably that has increased the number of informally living Eritreans, especially in Tigray, probably now affected by the conflict. That said, the report also discussed tension between refugees and host communities. Well, it's true. We observe it, and we witness with the right witness that there are rise in tensions, especially because many people now rented outside the campus. There is a rise in the price of house rent, inflation, the food cost, and the living cost. But where I have some reservation is that when we say these two things are a little bit forgotten. One, as compared to the perception of the people is as compared to the advantage. refugee camps bring to the locality, the tensions are quite less. Many people, many surrounding believe that with the campus, there are a lot of advantages. Business have been booming, infrastructures have increased. So there is kind of mutual understanding between the refugees and the hosts, especially with the new approach to refugees, which include the host community. There are a lot of incentives that the surrounding people count on. So there are tensions, no doubt, but there are also positive aspects. Second is when we talk tension, we especially emphasize on these 3 refugee camps in Tigray. 3 other refugee camps. One is in Tigray, but inhabited mainly by the Kunama in Western Tigray. The Shimelba camp, 70% of them are Kunama. 2 refugee camps in Afar, resided by Afar refugees. Here, refugee host community relation is quite good. These are where we don't see much secondary migration. There is no mobility as such. The people count on their local integration, local solidarity, especially in good inter-ethnic relation. In Tigray, there is historical suspicion between Tigrinya refugees from Eritrea and the Tigrayans in Tigray, but you don't find that in Afar and among the Kunama, which usually policymakers do not build on those good relation, and the new refugee proclamations, the job compact, those do not build on those areas. But then related to this is on moving onward and intervention. Yes, I agree. The report says the bad situation in the campus, in a sense, the situation of the shelter, situation of water, situation of sanitation, those all are factors for refugees moving out of the camp and further into Sudan, Libya, and Europe. I agree. But many of the refugees who are moving on are refugees who have better connection. Okay, thank you. Who have better connection, who have better networks, and who have the resource. You see, people who are left in the protracted situation are those who have no such resource. So it's not only because of that, but because they have the resource. And as compared to, if you compare these refugee camps inhabited by Afar and the Kunama are called, you see, the forgotten camps. Even interestingly, the donors do not remember those camps. The situation in the camp is dire, more than those who are moving. Thus, if we relate, the European donors and European and international NGOs focus on those camps which are mobile, which are dynamic, from where people move to the north. But there are, in this campus, there are people, probably like 70–80% of the refugees in the forgotten camps are not mobile, not because their life is better than the others, because they don't have the resource. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Fekadu. And now we hand the word over to Hans Storgaard from the Danish Red Cross. Go ahead.
Hi, Hans. Thank you so much. Thank you for these, for the work conducted, and also big thanks to Dr. Tekalign for the work done with the paper and our initial discussions in Addis. Having read this policy brief, I find some of these recommendations and some of the points also something that we as the Red Cross encounter in our work on a daily basis. And I think it's personally, I think it's an important discussion to have to address these current challenges and the situation for Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia, in particular in light of the latest development, both with the COVID, but also with the crisis in Tigray. I have also a few points that I want to emphasize on, but also would like to highlight some challenges that we are facing as a humanitarian actor in the current situation. I think my main point is, first, I would like to talk a little bit about the burden that the host community also faces. Last year, I visited the border area of Salambesa in the eastern Tigray to understand the challenges and both of the refugees, but also the challenges that the host community faced. And I think this was shortly after the border closure. But even though the border was closed, and as Dr. Fekadu said, there is movement between the border, I saw that there was an overwhelmingly positive atmosphere about the peace agreement, but also a feeling of increased opportunities with the opening, with the trade. But however, we are also working in other places in Tigray where we don't encounter this. In Shire, in Mekele, the frustration is a bit, there's a bit more frustration from the host community, and as explained, increased friction due to lack of access to employability, work, but also deforestation and increased housing rents. I think one of the main points that we have encountered is the result of this being host community members, in particular youth, being displaced or migrating further, which is also a bit of a challenge. We've seen that young people from those border areas or from areas close to where the refugee camps are located, they seek or migrate towards Addis or even abroad. And as Danish Red Cross, we worked a lot with supporting Ethiopian migrant returnees from abroad, in particular from the Gulf countries. And a lot of the stories that we hear, in particular, for instance, returnees from Shire, is that the initial migration abroad and even the remigration that they're doing has been due to lack of opportunities, scarcity of resources that has impacted the livelihoods. And I think one of my main points by addressing this is to say that we, even in some parts of Tigray, we actually encounter, and actually not just in Tigray, in Ethiopia, we encounter host communities being willing and have good intentions of supporting refugees. We also see that it's not just it doesn't just come with opportunities. It also comes with a burden, which is rarely addressed by humanitarian agencies due to lack of resources compared to the needs that we face. I think our work in these communities have exactly also shown us that there is a need for investing in ensuring adequate protection and durable solutions for the refugees, but as well taking into consideration the host community. And although we have seen policies being developed on this, it needs to be more operationalized on the ground. And I think this is also what we hear from our discussions with other agencies and ARA in Tigray. My second point is regarding the impact of COVID. I think when the whole pandemic raged across the world, and in particular in Denmark in March, I think we were bracing ourselves for what will be next in Ethiopia, and in particular fearing the enormous pressure on the healthcare system. And as mentioned by the other panelists, we already know that basic services were under pressure prior to COVID in the camps. We know that migrants or refugees are in particular vulnerable, and these challenges would just further exacerbate the challenges and living conditions. For us, we were in particular concerned about what kind of restrictions will impact, because living in a camp-like setting with the high density, it's almost impossible to protect yourself and self-isolate if you are contracted with COVID. In particular, also upholding proper hygiene and sanitary conditions. And I think, once again, we would just see that vulnerable people will be exposed and will be at risk. I think, as mentioned, the healthcare provision in the camps were before COVID quite under pressure. And I want to use one example that also the Ministry of Health also contributed by imposing strict restrictions to ensure that there was no contraction of the virus, but it also highly disrupted many of the basic services which were provided. And one thing was that the Ministry of Health enforced a 14 days mandatory quarantine for everyone crossing the Ethiopian borders, which led that many of the refugees coming from Eritrea were taken to a separate quarantine facility and not registered and placed in camps as normally what they would have access to. Although it's not the perfect conditions, they would have access to a variety of services. Being in a separate quarantine facility, they were not assisted with the basic services. And I think as for us as Red Cross, we were able to support and distribute with some essential items, but I think it's very clear that being stuck in a separate facility without ability to move has really severely challenged the mental health of many vulnerable migrants and refugees. Yes, my third point to the policy brief is of course also what has been mentioned before, is the secondary displacement. And I found it very interesting that the research of Dr. Tekalign, and in my conversations with him about these new trends and routes through Uganda to Latin America, we have in our work, we have encountered a lot of movement towards the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and we are frequently seeing that this number is slowly increasing, that Eritreans are using the Eastern Corridor to reach the Gulf countries. It is also something that is reported by IOM, who does this displacement tracking matrix. And I think even though we don't have verified numbers, I think the anticipation is that the number of Eritreans going that direction is a bit higher than normally reported. What is interesting for me is that they initially don't identify themselves as Eritreans, but as Ethiopians. And I don't know how long this has taken place, but clearly I think it tells us something about that life in an Ethiopian camp is not a durable solution, and as long as there's no real options for people in these camps, we can expect triggers of further migration or displacement. So maybe just to say a few words on the current situation, I think it's obviously clear that with the ongoing crisis, life and conditions for the most vulnerable Eritrean refugees are severely impacted and has been further complicated. As a humanitarian organizations, we have had access problems, which remains a massive challenge for us. It has mainly been due to security. We had 3 ambulances attacked in the beginning of November, and this is the main concern for us at the moment, is the unlimited access. We have succeeded in bringing a convoy of humanitarian assistance to Mekelle with the food and medicine and some NFIs on Saturday. And that was the first convoy for almost 6 weeks since the fighting has broken out that managed to reach parts of Tigray with humanitarian assistance. The main challenge is also that the lack of communication, ability to reach different areas in Tigray, but also fuel, electricity has been disrupted, and which has also affected the ability of humanitarian organizations to provide assistance. We know hospitals are running low, and in urgent need of supplies to be able to operate and assist patients. As Red Cross, we have a team also in Shiri that we have only had a sporadic conversation with. We hope that we can reach them by today. We have a team from Addis who are trying to reach them today or tomorrow. And these guys have been in Shiri, has been operating on the ground with ambulance service and distributing non-food items, but has been unable to leave Shiri town and actually reach the refugee camps outside Shiri. And I think the refugee camps in Tigray is one of the biggest concerns at the moment, because normal food rations ran out by the end of November, and since then UN has been unable to access the camps. We know that some camps have been damaged, and which is also a big concern. For us, we can see that only Red Cross and MSF are able to operate inside Tigray at the moment. So it's clear that the needs remain high, and there's a need for other organizations also to be able to access the region. I think one of the main concerns is clearly that vulnerable populations such as refugees and migrants remain at risk, and we have already seen the first movements of people outside camps. So we have encountered for a few weeks ago that 1,000 refugees had reached Mekele from Shiri, asking for assistance. We know that 4,000 refugees have reached Addis, also from the Tigray region. And obviously it's hard to verify numbers, but we get information that there's a high number of displaced people in the region, and of course also refugees to Sudan. Lastly, I just want to say that as Red Cross, we have been assisting from day one with ambulances to North Gondar, and from North Gondar into Shira, and assist wounded and civilians. We have distributed non-food items in IDP sites, and we have provided first aid services, but clearly there is the situation is quite critical, and this would definitely affect the camps and the situation of refugees in a very highly unpredictable situation. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you very much, Hans, for that very important and interesting intervention. We have a question from senior researcher Neil Webster. There's been talk of Eritrean soldiers crossing the border and entering Tigray. And what does that mean to the Eritrean refugees who may have actually been fleeing military service? So that would be a question maybe for Tekalign, but also in a broader sense, we hear from Hans on the Danish Red Cross that the humanitarian aid is cut off, but has it also directly, in a security sense, impacted the refugees in the Tigray region that this conflict is ongoing? Tekalign, would you like to answer that one?
Yes, Hans, thanks. I think the dire situation already Hans Storgaard has quite well explained, because they are on the front line. They have updates. As you know, we have done this research some time before this conflict happens. Of course, we hear this allegations, counter allegations, media reports that soldiers are crossing the border, they are attacking refugees. There are these kinds of different kinds of reports. So far, these are simply maybe hearsays. I don't have a concrete evidence that Eritrean refugees. The government is saying like, no Eritrean refugee soldiers crossed the border. We managed. The Ethiopian government says it managed the war, the conflict, whatever we term it, by itself. So governments strictly denies this. So we don't have evidence or to prove or disprove whether the soldiers crossed the border and attacked the refugees or even taking them back. So there are these kinds of complaints from refugees, not now, even before. we hear these kinds of complaints. Sometimes Eritrean soldiers cross the border, take some soldiers back. These kinds of allegations have been very common. But for the moment, we don't have exact evidence on this. So we will see when the phone lines are opening and more communications are possible, maybe more updates would come on. But the government denies and also complains, of course, media reporting and fueling the conflict. So for me, the main issue is how fast the government manages the conflict and how the international community can have access. We are very happy that Red Cross with its convoy reached already to Mekelle, and also many other UN organizations have to reach to these refugees in camps and also in the towns. We know Eritrea already, Tigray is also hosting many IDPs already internally. They have their own problems in the region. So there are layers of problems in that region. So whenever the conflict continues, more risks. So the most important thing is they have to manage this conflict, and the phone lines and all communication should be open. But for this issue of Eritrean soldiers are crossing the border, we don't have evidence.
All right, thank you very much, Tekalign. I was wondering whether Fekadu, you would like to come in on this question also? Do you have anything to add to this question? And please remember to unmute yourself.
Yes. Sorry. No, I think that the Tekalign just said it. I mean, what we've been hearing is, as he said, accusations and the counter accusations. We haven't heard from people on the ground, and we haven't heard also the impact from people on the ground, but we've been reading media reports which are now more or less global. But we can't add our own information from the ground, and I think the Tekalign has said perfectly, to my opinion.
All right, thank you very much. I was interested in the question that Hans Storgaard also mentioned about the new routes opening and also people traveling to Saudi Arabia. And I was wondering whether you could say anything about, explore that question a little bit, also in the light of the current events. Would we expect the current pattern of out-migration from the region to be enforced here, or to be strengthened, or what do you expect will happen with the migration patterns of out-migration from the region? And maybe Fekadu, you can start, and then Tekalign can come in.
Well, at a certain point, I mean, the number of out-migration had reached like 500,000 annually, and there are three major routes of migration from Ethiopia, and actually migrants from Ethiopia also include migrants from Eritrea, from Somalia. There are these crisscrossing routes. So Somali migrants cross Ethiopia and they use the northwestern route to Sudan, Libya. Eritreans use different. So the number has been quite high, but now with COVID, with COVID, the number radically decreased, and those who were en route also, most of them were deported from en route to the Middle East, from Djibouti, from Somaliland. Some of them were stuck in Sudan. Many were again deported from Sudan. Now it's about this public health issue. Otherwise, those reasons for migrations, the desperate situation in the region has not been solved. So the migration will continue, no doubt, but it depends on this public health issue.
Thank you. Tekalign, would you like to come in on the question of migration and in the light of the conflict and also COVID-19?
Yes. I think Fekadu properly mentioned. I mean, to quickly, comment on this. Given the challenges continued, and also still the opportunities and the prospects for Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia is still very challenging. So we expect the out-migration likely would continue. And of course, the routes are not linear to Europe, or we can't predict like, okay, they're coming from this to that. So it's like crisscross, routes change, mobility patterns change, migration conditions change. They respond to quickly to border regimes, to conditions in different routes change, new routes emerge. Migration will continue. From my own experience for the last 10, 12 years, I've been researching migration in East Africa, Ethiopia and Eritrea. So this would, from my experience, I expect this would more likely to continue in the coming, decade or more, because the underlying refugee generating conditions, underlying migrating generation conditions in Ethiopia, in the region generally, still never changed. Even more needs are coming. So what we can imagine is, of course, they redirect always. We will see. Currently, the pattern is, of course, to Gulf states and also to South Africa and Uganda. Of course, Africa is becoming, South migration is becoming very, very important, which is ignored in many researches. Most studies focus on South-North migration to Europe, but now Southeast migration, South migration, Southwest migration is now culture, becoming a norm now. And I imagine this would likely to continue. So yeah, that's what I have.
Thank you so much.
I think, sorry, Hans, just one point to that. I think what we have also already started to see, even with COVID, is that people are trying more dangerous routes. They are being subjected to trafficking. So we see also a change in the way people migrate.
And Hans, I also wanted to follow up on the thing you said, that the food rations were actually running out and had run out by the end of November in the northern regions in Ethiopia. Can you give us a sense of how concerned you are, how concerned the humanitarian community is about what's going on in terms of food security for the refugees in northern Ethiopia?
I think we're very concerned with the situation, and I think also maybe just to mention, it's not just the camps; it's actually also that now is the harvesting season in that region, and people cannot access their fields. So as long as supply chains are disrupted, there is a big concern about whether people can actually manage to go through. And I think that in the event that assistance will not be provided, we can expect that people will start to move from where they are.
All right, thank you. And I just want to, we are actually running over time. It's very difficult to control academics and keep them to 10 minutes. But I think I just want to ask Tekalign one last question, maybe also Fekadu could follow up. You mentioned that the situation of the refugees in the Tigray region right now would also depend on what kind of conflict resolution will take place after the conflict is over. So, and as I understood you, the local authorities in the Tigray region need to be on board any kind of peace or conflict resolution for the good of the refugees. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you see would need to happen for the refugees? I mean, on a political level, for the refugees to be in a better place when this conflict is over. Thank you.
Yes, Hans. Yeah. I think we all look forward how fast and how sustainably this conflict managed transforms to peace in the region. This is a concern for everyone in Ethiopia, as well as for the international communities and humanitarian agencies. Of course, we have hope as well. Conflict is conflict, and also the result would be also maybe positively transform the region. We will see. We don't know, but from experiences and from political history, from the political culture in the region, we can imagine that, for example, the peace deal never materialized because of mainly because of the Tigray regime was not willing to take part and also to have it has its own concern with the central government in Addis Ababa and also in Eritrea. So, but now I think if conflict properly managed and transformed into lasting peace in the region, of course, the fruits of peace deal would come. Actually, that's my expectation, my opinion, because mobility would be more easier, and also all the positive things might happen in the region. But we will see how fast the conflict is ending in the region, and how the government reconstructs the infrastructures which were destroyed. We have experience from other countries. So when conflict happens, it's not easy to transform it quickly. History tells us this, but Ethiopian government is confident. They say we have already managed the conflict. We are even, capable of providing all the services and reconstructing the region very shortly. Even in the midterm, if they manage to bring peace and to control the region and also reconciliation, all these political processes, post-conflict transformation steps, we know either it's reconciliation or it's also dialogue, or also rebuilding the infrastructure, and also opening up the communication lines, and if the war, at least the violence ends quickly, then of course it is also hope for the community first as well, and the refugees, the vulnerable groups, the IDPs. The needs, the humanitarian concerns are huge, also from the international community, also from Ethiopians as well in abroad. Sometimes also we are very concerned about the interests of international intervention. It's good, humanitarian aids are very important, but sometimes also there is huge interest in the region, as you know. Horn Africa generally, the world powers are interested to intervene. Some are for positive, some have its own political interests. Media is exaggerating all this what's happening in the region. So there are genuine concerns from international communities. We are very happy with this, but there are also fueling of the fire by some media outlets, which is also not good for us. So we don't want to exaggerate or diminish the level of the problem. So there are different interests. So now it's in a match. We will see what would happen. So we look forward to positive developments. I'm optimistic, actually.
Thank you, Tekalign. Dr. Fekadu, any last thoughts on the situation of the refugees in the Tigray region and what needs to happen for them in the short term? And please remember to unmute yourself.
No, as Hans Storgaard said, we've heard that, including from government media, that some refugees number Hans mentioned, but I haven't heard that number from others, that many refugees run from the campus. Some are en route to Gondar, some of them are in Gondar, some are in Addis Ababa, as he said. Ethiopian government asks them to go back to the campus. So, which means, as Tekalign said, the quick end to the conflict would help these refugees who are running, to be back to relatively, I say relatively, because already refugees' life is not stable. It's a life in limbo. But now this is an additional problem to their already life in limbo. So if at least, some of the refugees have children, some have their old parents with them, who joined them during the border opening or after the peace deal. So we would like to see them be back into stable situation wherever it is, whether it's in camp or wherever. So we wanted them to be supported. The international community should show more engagement in supporting them. They're on the run. The other one, as Tekalign said, the last 1-2 years, there has been a dispute over refugee governance, especially in Tigray. The refugees were caught between the two governments, the federal and the Tigrayan government disputes. So the refugees were a little bit concerned with the dispute between the regional government and even before the war and the federal government. One of the camps, his ask camp was the federal government proposed to shut it down. The regional government said no. So they were divided between the two. There are different actors who want to make use of the refugees' presence there. So refugees need a stable life. For instance, in other regions where refugee hosting regions, for instance, in Gambela, in Somali region, there are development initiatives as part of CRRF and others, interventions, on development interventions that include the refugees and the hosts. That has been slow because of the dispute in Tigray. You don't see much initiative in Sudan, in Tigray, but the refugees need that initiative. The host needs that initiative. So we would like to see things back to normal.
All right, thank you very much, Fekadu. Our time is up, unfortunately, but I want to thank the panelists for taking the time to join us here at this DIIS webinar, and also for the attendees. So thank you very much.
Thank you too.
Thank you.